My own brother vowed to erase me from the family. First, while my parents laughed and called me nothing but a paycheck, so I took back every inch of my house. The kitchen smelled like burnt garlic and my mother's cigarettes, and my brother was standing between me and the refrigerator like he owned it. "You've always been nothing but a paycheck to this family," Sawyer said. "Maybe it's time we cut you out completely." I had a bank statement in my hand. $51,800 gone in a single transfer. My name was on the account. My name was on the mortgage. My name was on every bill taped to the corkboard behind him. Somewhere upstairs, my father's borrowed television played a rerun I didn't recognize. Laugh track rolling under the argument like a soundtrack nobody had asked for. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something colder. The specific stillness that comes right before a person stops absorbing damage and starts cataloging it instead. "Say that again," I said. He did, slower, like I was slow. "We don't need you, Harlow. We just needed your house." Behind him, my father laughed, actually laughed, a short bark through his nose like Sawyer had told a joke at a barbecue. My mother didn't laugh, but she didn't stop him either. She wiped down a counter that wasn't dirty and let the words sit in the room like smoke. "You've been a paycheck since you were 22, my dad said. "That's not an insult, kiddo. That's just what you're good at." I looked at the three of them. My father, 58, arms crossed like he was the injured party. My mother, 55, scrubbing a clean counter because her hands needed something to do that wasn't looking at me. My brother, 27, standing in my kitchen in a house he'd never once helped pay for, telling me I was disposable. Piper was upstairs. I could hear the ring light humming through the ceiling, the one she'd wired into my old home office. "Get out of my house," I said. Sawyer smiled like I'd finally said something interesting. "It's not just your house anymore," he said. "It hasn't been for months. You just haven't noticed." I looked down at the statement in my hand one more time. Then I folded it, put it in my back pocket, and walked out to my car without another word. I didn't slam the door. I didn't yell. I drove to a hotel on Schrock Road and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to call a lawyer. That night was the end of pretending, but it wasn't the beginning of the story. The beginning started 2 years earlier, with a house I built alone and a family who decided that made it theirs. I'm Harlow Reyes. I'm 31 years old, and at the time all this happened, I was a senior operations analyst at Meridian Freight Systems, a logistics company outside Columbus, Ohio. I'd worked there since I was 23, starting as a scheduling coordinator, making $41,000 a year and working my way up through 6 titles and 4 raises until I was clearing $98,000 plus bonuses in a good quarter. I still remember the day I got pre-approved for the mortgage, sitting in a loan officer's office on my lunch break, hands folded in my lap, half convinced there'd been some clerical error when the number came back higher than I expected. Nobody co-signed for me. Nobody gifted me a down payment the way some of my coworkers' parents had for them. I did it with spreadsheets and a rigid budget and a stubborn refusal to let myself believe a house like that wasn't meant for someone like me. I bought my house in March of 2021. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a quarter-acre lot on Cortland Drive in Westerville, 20 minutes north of downtown Columbus. It cost $342,000. I put down $68,000, every cent of it mine, built from 6 years of skipped vacations, a used Honda I drove until the transmission gave out, and a habit of putting every bonus straight into savings instead of spending it. I didn't inherit that down payment. Nobody handed it to me. I earned it in overtime hours and Sunday shifts and turning down 100 small pleasures other people my age didn't think twice about. My family didn't come from money. My dad, Walt, spent 30 years doing HVAC repair, the kind of work that wrecks a person's knees and back by 50. He stopped working steady jobs around 2019 after a disc injury he said made it impossible to climb into crawl spaces anymore. He collected a partial disability payment, $1,100 a month, and picked up cash jobs here and there that he never reported. My mom, Ivy, worked the front desk at a dental office in Reynoldsburg for almost 20 years before she quit in 2020 to, in her words, take care of your father full-time. She was 55. He could walk fine. He just didn't want to anymore. Sawyer was the baby of the family, 4 years younger than me, and everyone treated him like it his whole life. He dropped out of Columbus State after 3 semesters. He'd worked at a car dealership, a call center, a gym, and briefly sold supplements through something called Virion Wellness that turned out to be a multi-level marketing scheme that cost him $4,000 in starter inventory he never sold. None of those jobs lasted past 5 months. He always had a reason. The manager was toxic. The hours were exploitative. The commute wasn't worth it. My parents nodded along every time, like Sawyer was a weather system they had no control over instead of a 27-year-old man. There was an earlier incident back in 2019 that I didn't think much of at the time, but that I now understand was the first real warning. I'd just gotten my graduation bonus from Meridian, $3,200 for hitting a departmental milestone. Sawyer asked to borrow it. He said he had a lead on a car detailing business, said he just needed capital to buy equipment, said he'd pay me back within 3 months. I gave it to him because he was my little brother and because my parents told me family helps family. 3 months became 6. 6 became never. When I finally asked about it at a Thanksgiving dinner in 2021, my mother told me I was being petty for bringing up money at the table. My father told me Sawyer had a lot going on. Sawyer himself just shrugged and said, "I mean, you make way more than me. It's not like you needed it." Nobody ever called that theft. They called it family. There was a second incident too, smaller, easier to forget, from the summer of 2022. I'd started dating someone seriously for the first time in years, a man named Colin I'd met through a coworker, and Sawyer showed up uninvited to a dinner I was hosting for the two of us, ate half the meal I'd cooked, and stayed until nearly midnight, cracking jokes about my commitment issues in front of a man I'd known for 6 weeks. Colin and I didn't last much longer after that. I never said anything to Sawyer about it directly. I told myself it was a one-off, an overstep born out of boredom rather than anything intentional. Looking back, I think it was the first time I saw, and chose not to name, how little space he believed I was entitled to keep for myself. Before all of this, we weren't a broken family. We were close, in the specific way families get close when they've survived something together. My parents scraped by when I was a kid. There were a few years in the early 2000s when the power got shut off twice, and my mom cried at the kitchen table doing math with a calculator that never balanced. I remembered that. I think it's part of why I worked so hard, why I built the life I built. I wanted to make sure nobody I loved ever sat at that table again. That's exactly what made it so easy for them to walk back in and take it. My parents had never fully recovered from those early lean years, not financially, and not in the way they talked about money either. My dad treated every dollar that came into the house as something to be managed rather than earned, a scarcity mindset that never adjusted even after his kids grew up, and the worst of it should have been behind them. My mom, for her part, had built her entire identity around keeping the peace, around smoothing things over so nobody had to sit with an uncomfortable truth for too long. It made her warm. It also made her nearly incapable of holding my father or my brother accountable for anything, because accountability, in her mind, was just another kind of conflict she was responsible for preventing. In June of 2024, my dad called me on a Tuesday night. His voice was tight in a way I'd learned to recognize as trouble. Their landlord in Reynoldsburg had raised the rent from $1,400 to $1,900 a month, and between his disability check and whatever cash work he could still manage, they couldn't make it work. Sawyer and Piper, who'd been living in a studio apartment in Whitehall, were in a similar spot. Piper's rent had jumped too, and neither of them had steady income to absorb it. "We just need somewhere to land," my dad said. "6 months, tops. We'll get back on our feet and we'll be out of your hair." I had 4 bedrooms and 1 person living in them. I said yes. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was doing what a good daughter does. I told myself 6 months was a fixed, finite thing, a number with an ending built into it. I was wrong about all 3. They moved in on June 14th, 2024. My dad, my mom, 2 mismatched suitcases, and 4 garbage bags of clothes between them. Sawyer showed up 4 days later with Piper, 26, a self-described brand consultant and lifestyle content creator with 3,000 followers on an account that posted almost exclusively pictures of iced coffee and inspirational quotes about abundance. She brought 3 boxes and a Bluetooth speaker and moved into my garage, which I'd converted years earlier into a small guest suite with a mini fridge and its own bathroom. For about 2 weeks, it was almost fine. There was noise I wasn't used to. There were dishes in the sink that weren't mine, but there was also the sound of my mother's laugh in the kitchen, the smell of her cooking again, something I hadn't had in the house since I moved in alone. I let myself believe this could work. Then the 2 weeks ended, and so did the illusion. The kitchen was the first casualty. Within 2 weeks, my counters were covered in takeout containers, my sink was permanently full, and someone kept leaving the stove burner on low, unlit, gas hissing quietly into the room until I caught it myself at 11 at night. My electric bill tripled from $110 to over $340 because Sawyer and Piper ran the air conditioning at 68 degrees around the clock and left every light in the house on like it cost nothing. I told myself it was an adjustment period. 5 different people, 1 house, some friction was normal. Piper made herself comfortable fast. Neither she nor Sawyer worked a single consistent day that summer. They spent afternoons by my pool, Piper's speaker blasting from a chair I'd bought for myself, a rotating cast of her friends showing up on weekends to float on inflatables I never remembered agreeing to buy. I came home from 10-hour shifts at Meridian to find 6 strangers in my backyard and my own beach towels hanging wet over my porch railing. I tried to bring structure to it. In July, I made a chore chart, color-coded, laminated, taped to the inside of a cabinet door. Trash on Mondays and Thursdays. Dishes rotated by day. Common areas wiped down nightly. It was the kind of thing that would have worked in any functional household. Sawyer photographed it and posted it to his Instagram story with the caption, "My sister really made us a chore chart like we're in a group home, LOL. 40-something comments rolled in calling me controlling, uptight, that sister. People who'd never met me weighing in on a household they knew nothing about. He didn't take it down for 3 days. The same week, my Cortland Estates HOA sent me a violation notice and a $300 fine for a large, unauthorized gathering with excessive noise. On a Saturday, I'd worked a full shift and hadn't even been home. Piper had invited a dozen people over for what she called a content shoot. I paid the fine because contesting it would have taken longer than just writing the check, and because arguing with the HOA felt easier than arguing with my own family. Then Piper took my car. I came out one Sunday morning to find my Honda gone from the driveway. She'd taken it to drive 2 friends to Cedar Point, a 5-hour round trip I only learned about after the fact because nobody asked me. It came back 11 hours later with a fresh dent in the rear passenger door, an empty gas tank, and a takeout wrapper wedged into my seat cushion. Piper's apology was, "It's just a car, Harlow, don't be dramatic." Sawyer told me I should be grateful she didn't total it. I paid $210 out of pocket to have the dent pulled at a body shop off Cleveland Avenue rather than filing an insurance claim that would have raised my premium for years over a car I hadn't even been driving when it happened. The shop owner, an older man named Frank, asked me twice if I was sure I wanted to pay cash instead of going through insurance. Like he could tell just by looking at my face that something about the situation didn't add up. I told him it was easier this way. It wasn't, not really. It was just quieter, and by that point in the summer, quiet had started to feel like the only thing I could still control. Around the same time, my neighbor Carol, who'd lived 2 doors down since before I even bought the house, stopped me in the driveway to ask gently if everything was okay. She'd noticed the extra cars, the late-night noise, a shouting match between Sawyer and Piper that had spilled out onto the front lawn one night around 1 in the morning. I told her it was temporary, that my parents were between places, that it would sort itself out soon. I remember driving to work the next day turning that conversation over in my head, embarrassed that a woman I barely knew had a clearer read on how unsustainable things had become than I was willing to admit to myself. My pantry became another quiet battlefield that same month. I started buying groceries specifically for myself, marking bags with my initials, only to find them opened and half-eaten within 2 days regardless. When I brought it up, Piper told me I was being weirdly territorial about snacks for someone with a 4-bedroom house. Sawyer told me I should be glad everyone was eating together like a real family for once, as if the food had simply appeared rather than come out of my paycheck twice a month. I decided it was time to talk about money directly. I sat my parents down in the living room in August and laid it out plainly. Groceries were running me an extra $600 a month. Utilities were up over $200. I wasn't asking for rent. I was asking for anyone in that house to contribute something. My dad said they had no extra money to give. My mom said something that I still hear some nights when I can't sleep. "You're a daughter, Harlow," she said, "not a landlord." Sawyer, overhearing from the hallway, laughed and said, "Money's the only thing you've ever been good for anyway, so maybe just let us have this one." I didn't respond. I went upstairs, closed my bedroom door, and sat on the edge of my bed doing math in my head that didn't add up no matter how I ran it. When I tried to raise the subject of money a second time, in early November, my father took a different approach entirely. He told me the stress of being treated like a tenant in his own daughter's house was making his back worse, that his doctor had mentioned his blood pressure was elevated, that maybe if I stopped bringing up bills so often, he'd be able to actually rest and heal the way he needed to. My mother backed him immediately, telling me I needed to think about what it would do to me if something happened to him while we were fighting over rent money. I sat there in the living room and watched my own concern for my father's health get repurposed, in real time, into a weapon against me. I dropped the subject. I told myself I was being compassionate. I understand now I was just being managed. 6 months came and went in December, and nobody so much as mentioned packing a bag. I brought it up myself, gently, over dinner. I asked when everyone thought they'd be moving on. The table went quiet in a way that told me the question itself was the offense. "We're family," my dad said. "Family doesn't keep score, Harlow. I thought we raised you better than that." That was the moment I understood the 6 months had never been real to them. It had only ever been real to me. January brought the credit card. I found out about it by accident, checking my credit through an app I used to track my mortgage rate. A new account had opened in November under my name and my social security number, a Capital One card with a $1,900 balance, furniture, a ring light stand, a drone, a pair of noise-canceling headphones. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't authorized it. I called the number, sat on hold for 40 minutes, and confirmed what I already suspected. The application had been submitted online, using my personal information from the house's shared Wi-Fi network. I confronted Sawyer with the statement printed and folded in my hand. He didn't even try to deny it right away. He just looked mildly inconvenienced, the way someone looks when a rideshare driver cancels on them. "Piper needed capital for her brand," he said. "It's not a big deal. We were going to pay it off once her partnership deals came in." "You opened a credit card in my name without asking me," I said. "That's fraud, Sawyer. That's not a favor you did yourself. That's a federal crime." "Don't be so dramatic," he said. "It's family money. It all comes back around anyway." I called Capital One back, disputed the charges, closed the account, and spent 3 hours on the phone over the next week making sure it didn't tank my credit score before it reported. My parents' response, when I told them what happened, was to ask me why I was making such a big deal out of it when nothing bad had actually happened to me yet. I should have packed their bags myself that week. I didn't. I kept thinking there was a version of this where it resolved itself, where enough patience wore down whatever this was into something reasonable again. Instead, it got worse. 2 weeks after the credit card, I came home from a 10-hour shift to find my bedroom gutted, not messy, gutted. My bed frame was gone, my dresser was gone, my clothes, my books, the framed photo of my grandmother that had sat on my nightstand since I moved in, all of it was stuffed into black contractor bags lined up in the hallway like garbage waiting for pickup. My parents had moved into my master bedroom while I was at work. I found my dad sitting on what used to be my bed, remote in hand, watching my television like he'd lived there for years. "What is this?" I said. "It wasn't really a question. It just makes more sense, kiddo," he said, not even looking away from the screen. "We're two people. You're one. The master's the biggest room in the house. It's a waste for just you." My mother appeared in the doorway with a stack of towels, new towels, towels I hadn't bought, and said, "We already moved your things into the guest room. It's really not that different." I stood in the hallway looking at trash bags full of my life while my father adjusted the volume on my television, and I said nothing. I picked up the bag with the framed photo of my grandmother in it, carried it into the guest room myself, and unpacked it onto a nightstand that wasn't mine, in a room that used to be for visitors, in a house with my name on every piece of paper that mattered. I called my mother later that night, once I'd had time to compose myself, and asked her plainly why nobody had thought to mention it to me before it happened. "We didn't think you'd mind," she said. "You're gone all day anyway. What difference does it make which room you sleep in?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't have started a fight I didn't have the energy for, so I let it go. The same way I'd let go of the chore chart, the HOA fine, the dented car. Each time, letting it go felt smaller than fighting it. Each time, I didn't yet understand how much those small surrenders were adding up to. A week after that, it was the office. I worked from home 2 days a week, and my office had always been my sanctuary. A converted bedroom with a standing desk, 2 monitors, and a filing cabinet with 3 years of tax documents and mortgage paperwork. I came home on a Wednesday to find the desk gone, the monitors gone, the filing cabinet shoved into a corner of the garage under a tarp. Piper had turned it into a filming studio. A daybed sat where my desk used to be. A ring light stood in the corner, cables running to an outlet I'd specifically wired for my computer equipment. One of my monitors sat cracked against the garage wall, a spiderweb fracture across the screen, tossed aside like it was disposable because to her, it was. That was the same week I found the receipt. It was tucked into a stack of Piper's mail that had been left on the kitchen counter, addressed not to Piper Voss, the name I knew her by, but to a Piper Voss Whitfield from a company called Lumen Capital Partners. I didn't think much of it at the time beyond a flicker of confusion. People used maiden names, married names, professional names. I set it back down and went to find someplace quiet to sit. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I logged into my savings account on my laptop just to look at the number, just to remind myself that something in my life still belonged only to me. $51,800, 3 years of overtime, bonuses, a decade of denying myself things other people my age didn't think twice about. I closed the laptop and let myself breathe for the first time in weeks. The next morning, it was gone. Not partially gone. Gone. A single wire transfer, executed at 2:47 in the morning while I slept, moving all $51,800 out of my account and into one I didn't recognize. The transfer had come from my own laptop, using my own saved login credentials. The laptop Piper had access to most nights while I was asleep. The laptop that lived on the kitchen counter because I no longer had an office to keep it in. I confronted all 3 of them in the kitchen that morning, my hands shaking so hard I had to set the phone down on the counter to keep from dropping it. My father shrugged before I even finished the sentence. "We invested it," he said. "Sawyer's launching an online store. This is startup capital. It's not like the money's gone. It's theft," I said. "You wired money out of my personal savings account without asking me. That is theft." My mother crossed her arms. "You're being so selfish about money you're just going to earn back anyway," she said. "You make good money, Harlow. You'll be fine." That was the moment something in me went quiet and cold and permanent. I stopped feeling guilty standing in my own kitchen. I stopped waiting for an apology that was never coming. I called my bank that same hour and learned the ugly truth. Because the transfer had used my own saved credentials from a device inside my own home, accessed by a household member, it didn't qualify as simple third-party fraud. The bank couldn't just reverse it. I would need a lawyer. I hired one that week. Her name was Vera Solis, a civil litigation attorney with an office in Dublin, 20 minutes from the house. I sat across from her desk with a folder of screenshots, bank statements, the credit card dispute paperwork, photos of my gutted bedroom, and the HOA fine notice, and I watched her face change as she went through it page by page. "This isn't a family disagreement," she told me. "This is a pattern." Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Sawyer, it turned out, wasn't finished. 3 days after I hired Vera, my manager at Meridian called me into her office. Sawyer had called the front desk claiming I was having a breakdown and might not be safe to be handling client accounts. My manager, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Talia Brooks, told me she didn't believe a word of it, but that HR would need it documented regardless. "Keep working," she told me, "and log every single call he makes. If he does it again, we'll have a paper trail." 2 days after that, Sawyer posted about me publicly. A long, aching paragraph on his Instagram about how his cold, calculating older sister was throwing their sick, elderly parents out onto the street over a small misunderstanding about money. He didn't mention the $51,000. He didn't mention the credit card. He framed 6 months of theft and displacement as a family spat I'd blown out of proportion, and hundreds of strangers who knew none of us lined up in the comments to call me a monster, cold, ungrateful, cruel to my own aging parents. I didn't respond to a single comment. I took screenshots of all of it instead, time-stamped, saved to a folder folder Vera had asked me to keep. Every post, every comment, every insult became evidence instead of injury. It was the first time in months I'd found something like control. That same week, on Vera's recommendation, I hired a forensic accountant named Judah Okafor to trace the wire transfer. Judah had spent 11 years working fraud cases for regional banks before going independent, and he took my folder of statements with the calm, unhurried focus of someone who'd seen every version of this story before. Judah worked the way I imagined a surgeon worked, methodical, unbothered by the emotional wreckage of the case, focused entirely on the trail of numbers in front of him. He pulled bank routing records, cross-referenced business registration filings with the Ohio Secretary of State's office, and ran Piper's name, and the 2 spelling variations of it she'd used across different accounts, against a database of small claims filings and civil judgments in 3 states. He called me once mid-search just to confirm a date on an old screenshot I'd sent him, and I could hear in the background the quiet clicking of someone building a case with the patience of a person who had done this 100 times before, and never once gotten emotionally attached to how it would end. It took him 2 days to trace where my $51,800 had actually gone. It hadn't gone into a business account. It had passed through 2 intermediary accounts before landing in one belonging to a shell entity called Lumen Capital Partners, the same name printed on the piece of mail I'd found addressed to Piper Voss Whitfield. Judah slid a folder across his desk to me with a face that told me to brace myself before I opened it. Piper's real legal name is Piper Voss Whitfield, he said. Lumen Capital Partners has been registered and dissolved twice before, once in Cincinnati in 2021, once in Toledo in 2022. Same structure both times. Someone close to her, usually a partner or a family member of a partner, funds an online business launch. The business folds within 4 to 6 months. The money doesn't. I thought about the offhand comment Piper had made once, months earlier, laughing about a business that fell apart before it even had a chance, back when she used to live near Toledo. I'd nodded along at the time and forgotten it within the hour. It hadn't seemed like anything. It had, in fact, been everything. There's an open fraud investigation 2 counties from here right now, Judah told me. Piper Voss Whitfield is named in it. It's not public yet, but it's active. My family hadn't just decided to take advantage of me. They had handed me over to someone who did this for a living, someone with a proven method and 2 prior victims already behind her. And Sawyer, who'd met Piper 18 months earlier at a gym in Whitehall, who'd moved her into my garage within days of moving in himself, had either been an unwitting mark or a willing participant. Looking back at every choice he'd made in the 6 months since, from the credit card application to the timing of the wire transfer at 2:47 in the morning, on a night he knew I'd be deeply asleep, I no longer believed it was the former. I filed the eviction notice myself the following Monday, walking it into the Franklin County Courthouse in person, and I hired a process server to deliver it rather than serving it myself. I wanted a neutral third party there when it happened, someone whose account of my family's reaction couldn't later be twisted into another story about my cruelty. He served it on a Thursday afternoon, on my own front porch, and I watched from my car parked across the street as my mother took the envelope, read the first line, and went the color of drywall. 30 days, it read. Leave voluntarily, or a judge decides for you. My father snatched the papers out of her hands before she'd finished reading. We'll fight this, he shouted, loud enough that I heard it from the car with the windows up. Then spend money you don't have on a lawyer, I said when I finally walked up the driveway. You'll lose. Every piece of paper in that house has my name on it. That night, I checked into a hotel off Polaris Parkway, 10 minutes from Meridian's office, and for the first time in almost a year, I slept 8 straight hours without waking up to listen for footsteps in the hallway. Sawyer, when he heard about the eviction notice through my parents, sent me a string of texts over the course of an hour that I saved but never responded to. The first was angry, accusing me of trying to destroy the family over a business decision that just didn't pan out yet. The second, 20 minutes later, was different in tone entirely, almost pleading, reminding me of a trip to Kings Island we'd taken together when he was 15, as though a shared memory from a decade earlier could undo a wire transfer executed at 2:47 in the morning. The third text, sent just before midnight, was one line. You're really going to let a house mean more to you than your own brother. I read it 3 times before I put the phone face down on the nightstand and went to sleep. 3 days later, Vera called with news I wasn't prepared for. My family had retained their own attorney, a man named Preston Cale who specialized in landlord-tenant disputes. They weren't just contesting the eviction timeline anymore. They intended to argue under oath in front of a judge that I had invited them to live in the house permanently, that I had voluntarily abandoned my claim to the property by allowing them to occupy the master bedroom, and that the $51,000 transfer had been made with my full knowledge and blessing as an investment in Sawyer's business. It was a story with no evidence behind it, built entirely out of the assumption that a jury of strangers would believe blood over documents. It might have worked on people who didn't know me. It wasn't going to work on Vera Solis, and it wasn't going to work on a folder 3 inches thick with timestamps. My phone rang at 11 that night, in the hotel room, an unknown number with a Toledo area code. I stared at it for 4 rings, debating whether to let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. Is this Harlow Reyes? A woman's voice said. My name is Renata Cho. I think we need to talk about Piper Voss. Renata's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a kind of exhaustion I recognized instantly, because I'd been living inside it myself for months. She told me she'd lost $38,000 to Piper 2 years earlier, back when Piper had been dating Renata's cousin, back when the pitch had been almost word for word what I'd heard from Sawyer. Capital for a launch, family helping family, money that would come back around. She finds someone with equity, Renata said, a house, savings, something liquid. Then she gets close to someone in that person's life who can get her inside. It's never random. Your brother didn't stumble into this by accident, Harlow. Somebody like Piper doesn't waste 18 months on a man who can't get her access to something worth taking. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the phone pressed to my ear, and for the first time since June, I understood the full shape of what had happened to me. This wasn't a family that had simply taken advantage of my generosity out of entitlement and bad habits. This was a targeted, patient extraction, and my own brother had opened the door and held it while it happened. I asked her how she'd found me. She told me a mutual acquaintance from Piper's old circle in Toledo had seen Sawyer's public post about his cold sister and recognized the shape of the story immediately, the same shape it had taken with her cousin 2 years earlier, and passed Renata's number along in case it was useful. I almost didn't call, Renata admitted. It took me a long time to stop being ashamed of what happened to me. I figured you might be feeling some version of that too, and I didn't want to make it worse by dredging it back up. I told her it didn't feel like dredging. It felt like finally being believed by someone who didn't need convincing. Renata had records, bank statements, old text messages, a police report filed in Lucas County that had gone nowhere because she hadn't had a lawyer or a forensic accountant at the time. She agreed to send everything to Vera the next morning. It was, Vera told me later, the single most valuable piece of evidence in the entire case because it proved something no amount of family loyalty testimony could undo. Pattern, intent, premeditation. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late January in a small conference room at the Franklin County Courthouse rather than a full courtroom, since Vera had negotiated a settlement conference first to avoid dragging the eviction into a longer trial. My parents arrived with Preston Cale, a heavy-set man in a gray suit who looked like he'd already sensed which way this was going before anyone said a word. Sawyer arrived separately, 10 minutes late, with Piper trailing behind him in sunglasses she didn't take off indoors. Vera opened with the bank statement showing the $51,800 transfer, time-stamped at 2:47 in the morning, executed from a device inside the household. Then she laid out the credit card fraud, the notarized statement from Capital One confirming the account had been opened without my authorization. Then, without raising her voice, she introduced Judah's forensic report on Lumen Capital Partners. The shell company dissolved twice before under 2 different jurisdictions. And finally, Renata Cho's sworn statement describing an almost identical scheme 2 years earlier in Toledo. I watched my father's face while Vera read the dates aloud. Cincinnati, 2021. Toledo, 2022. Westerville, 2024. I watched something in his expression crack, not guilt exactly, but the first flicker of realization that the story he'd told himself for 6 months might not be the story that was actually true. Preston Cale asked for a recess to confer with his clients. It lasted 40 minutes. When they came back, my father's version of events had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, from "we invested in Sawyer's business" to "we were misled about where the money was going." He was already trying to separate himself from Sawyer before the ink was dry on anything. During that recess, I sat in the hallway with Vera while my family conferred behind a closed door 2 rooms down. She told me, in the calm, practical tone she used for everything, that this was the point in most cases like mine where families finally splintered along their real fault lines instead of their pretend ones. People will lie together as long as lying is free, she said. The second it starts costing them individually, you find out who they actually were the whole time. Money and consequence have a way of doing what months of honest conversation never could. I thought about that sentence for weeks afterward. It explained more about the last 8 months than anything else anyone had said to me. Sawyer noticed it too. I watched him notice it, watched something ugly settle behind his eyes as he realized his own father was quietly stepping backward, leaving him standing alone in the wreckage he'd built. "You knew," Sawyer said to Piper, low enough that it wasn't meant for the room, but the room heard it anyway. "You told me the accounts were clean. You told me this was different." Piper finally took off her sunglasses. "Don't do that," she said. "Don't act like you didn't know exactly what this was, Sawyer. You picked the house. You picked her." She tilted her head toward me without looking at me directly. "That was always the plan. Don't stand there acting like you're a victim now that it's not working out." The room went silent in a way that felt almost physical. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father stared at the table. Preston Cale closed his folder slowly, the sound of it unnaturally loud in the quiet. That was the moment I finally said what I'd been carrying since that night in the kitchen, with the bank statement in my hand. "You told me I was nothing but a paycheck," I said, looking directly at Sawyer. "You said it in my own kitchen, in the house I paid for alone," while Dad laughed. "I want you to understand something. I am not your paycheck anymore. I am not your safety net. I am not the sister who quietly absorbs whatever you decide to take from her because taking it from me is easier than building something yourself. You didn't just steal money from me. You let someone use me as a target and you helped her do it. That's not family. I don't know what that is, but it isn't that." Nobody in the room defended him, not Piper, not Preston Cale, and for the the first time in my entire life, not my parents. My mother spoke then, quietly, her voice unsteady in a way I'd never heard from her. "Sawyer," she said, "is this true? Did you know what she was doing this whole time?" He didn't answer her directly. He looked at the table the same way my father had looked at it minutes earlier, and the silence answered for him more clearly than any denial could have. My mother started crying, quietly, the kind of crying that comes from someone realizing too late what they let happen under their own roof. My father wouldn't look at me at all. He stared at a spot on the table like it might offer him an exit that didn't exist. Vera used the momentum of that silence to close out the settlement. Rather than fight a case they now understood they had no real chance of winning, my family agreed to vacate the property within 14 days instead of the original 30, in exchange for me not pursuing a separate civil suit against my parents personally for the credit card fraud, since Sawyer had been the one to physically open the account. I agreed. I wasn't interested in destroying my parents financially. I was interested in getting them out of my house and getting my life back. Sawyer wasn't offered the same mercy. Vera made clear on the record that the theft of the $51,000 remained a separate matter, and that given Judah's findings and Renata's statement, we were pursuing both restitution and a police report for fraud, not just against Piper, but against Sawyer directly, since it was his device that had accessed my account credentials on the night of the transfer. Walking out of that conference room, I passed Sawyer in the hallway. He looked smaller than I remembered him looking in my kitchen. He looked, for the first time since June, genuinely afraid. "Harlow," he said, "come on, we're still family. You didn't think that mattered a few weeks ago," I said. "I don't see why it should matter to me now." I didn't wait for a response. I walked past him, out through the courthouse doors, into cold January air that felt cleaner than anything I'd breathed in months. Moving day came on a Friday in early February, cold enough that the moving truck idled with its exhaust curling up into a gray sky. I took the day off work and stood in my own driveway watching two men my father hired carry furniture that wasn't even his, most of it purchased with money that had once belonged to me, loaded into a truck bound for a 2-bedroom apartment in Reynoldsburg he and my mother had scrambled to find in 11 days. My mother tried to talk to me twice that morning. The first time she asked if I wanted to keep the blue mixing bowls, the ones that had been hers before they were mine, a strange small offering that felt like an apology dressed up as a kitchen inventory question. I told her to keep them. The second time, she stood in the doorway of what used to be my bedroom, now stripped down to bare walls and carpet indentations where furniture that wasn't mine had sat for 8 months, and said, "I don't know how we let it get this far." I didn't have an answer for her that felt worth saying out loud. I just nodded and let her walk past me to the truck. Sawyer didn't come to help move anything. He sent a single text message that morning, "Hope you're happy." I didn't respond. Piper didn't come either. I later learned from Judah that she'd left the state entirely within 4 days of the settlement conference, resurfacing under yet another variation of her name in an apartment outside Nashville, presumably already scouting her next opportunity before the ink was dry on this one. She didn't get far. Detective Marisol Ruiz, who'd been quietly building the Lucas County fraud case against Piper for over a year, based largely on Renata's original police report, finally had enough corroborating evidence once Judah's findings and my case were added to the file. Piper Voss Whitfield was arrested in Nashville in April on multiple counts of fraud, spanning 3 states. Renata called to tell me before I even saw it in the news. "You gave us the third data point," she said. "It's what finally made it stick." Detective Ruiz called me herself a week later, thorough and businesslike, walking me through how the case had finally come together once Ohio and Tennessee authorities started comparing notes with Lucas County. She told me that without my case specifically, the pattern might never have crossed the threshold prosecutors needed to move forward, since Renata's original report, on its own, had been dismissed years earlier as a personal dispute rather than fraud. Sometimes it takes the third person before anyone in a position to do something believes it's a pattern instead of bad luck, she said. I thought about how long I'd spent believing the same thing about my own family, mistaking a pattern for a series of unrelated, forgivable accidents. Sawyer wasn't charged criminally. The county prosecutor, after reviewing everything Vera and Judah had assembled, decided the civil route made more sense given that he was, at least on paper, a family member with implied access rather than an outside actor, though the assistant prosecutor did note in her file that it was a close call. What he did face was a civil judgment. The court ordered him to repay the $51,800 in restitution, structured as a payment plan since he had no assets and no steady income to draw from, $38 a week for the next 26 years unless he came into a lump sum sooner. It was, Vera told me honestly, more of a symbolic ruling than a practical one. I would probably never see all of that money again, but I would see some of it, and more importantly, there was now a legal record of exactly what had happened, one that couldn't be rewritten later at another family dinner. The restitution hearing itself took less than 20 minutes. A magistrate named Judge Ellery Foss reviewed the settlement terms, asked Sawyer directly whether he understood he was agreeing to the payment schedule voluntarily, and noted for the record that the underlying facts, unauthorized access to a financial account belonging to a family member, were serious regardless of the civil rather than criminal disposition of the case. Sawyer said yes to everything in a flat, defeated voice I'd never heard him use before, not even as a kid getting in trouble. I didn't feel triumphant sitting there. I felt something quieter and heavier, closer to exhaustion finally being allowed to rest. Weeks later, a payment for 1 week showed up up in the account Vera had set up. $38, no note, no explanation. Then 2 months of silence, then another payment. I stopped trying to predict the pattern. I let it become exactly what it was. A slow, uneven trickle that would never fully repay what had actually been taken. Not just in dollars, but in the year I'd have to spend rebuilding trust in my own home. The extended family split in ways I hadn't expected. My Aunt Denise, my father's younger sister, called me 2 weeks after the settlement and told me she'd heard some version of the story from my mother and wanted to hear mine. I sent her the folder, the same one Vera had built, screenshots and statements and dates. She called back 3 days later, quieter than I'd ever heard her. "I'm so sorry, Harlow," she said. "I should have asked sooner. I just believed the version that was easiest to believe." Denise became something I hadn't had in months, someone in my family who didn't require me to prove myself before offering basic decency. She started calling every other Sunday, not to talk about Sawyer or my parents, just to talk, the way family is supposed to work when it isn't extracting something from you. My cousin Marcus, Sawyer's age, sent me a message that read simply, "Heard what happened. That's messed up. Hope you're doing okay." And it meant more to me than it probably should have, because it was the first message from anyone my brother's age that treated me like a person who'd been wronged instead of a cautionary tale about being too strict with family. He called a few days later, actually called instead of texting, and we talked for almost an hour about nothing important. Old cousins gossip, a job he was thinking about applying for, the kind of easy, low-stakes conversation I hadn't realized I'd been starving for until it was happening. My grandmother on my mother's side, Nana Ruth, 83 and sharp as ever, called me from her assisted living facility in April after Denise filled her in. She didn't ask for the folder. She didn't ask for proof. "I raised your mother to be softer than she should have been," she told me over the phone, her voice thin but steady. "Softness isn't the same thing as goodness, Harlow, whatever your mother believes. You did the hard, good thing. Don't let anybody in this family tell you otherwise. I've watched 3 generations of this family confuse silence for peace. Somebody had to be the one to stop." I cried after that call too, a different kind of crying than the one over the lake photo, something closer to relief. Not everyone came around. My father called me in March, drunk, at 10 at night, and told me I'd ruined this family over money and that he hoped I was proud of myself. I let him finish, told him I loved him, and told him I wasn't going to have this conversation again while he'd been drinking. I hung up. He didn't call again for 2 months. There were logistical wounds that took longer to close than the legal ones. My credit took a hit from the fraudulent card before the dispute cleared fully, dropping 41 points before it recovered over the following 4 months. I filed an insurance claim for the cracked monitor and some smaller damaged items, $1,200 total. Denied initially because the damage happened by a household member rather than a covered peril, then partially approved after Vera sent a firm letter clarifying the legal status of the occupants at the time. I spent $900 replacing carpet in the master bedroom where something, wine or nail polish, or I never determined what, had stained it permanently. I spent another $600 rewiring the office where Piper's equipment had left scorch marks near an outlet that hadn't been up to code for what she'd been running through it. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was exhausting. The slow tax of cleaning up after people who never once asked what any of it cost me beyond the number on a bank statement. Talia, my manager at Meridian, noticed the toll it was taking before I was willing to admit it myself. In late February, she pulled me aside after a Monday status meeting and told me, without making a production of it, that the company's benefits package included 8 free therapy sessions through an employee assistance program and that she'd used them herself 2 years earlier after her divorce. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Patricia Amato the following week, initially just to have somewhere to put the anger that had nowhere else to go. Those sessions became one of the few consistent, uncomplicated good things in my life that spring. An hour every other Wednesday where nobody needed anything from me except honesty. Dr. Amato was the one who first said out loud what I think I'd known for months, but hadn't let myself fully sit with. "You spent your whole life being useful to them," she told me, "and you built a house believing usefulness would eventually be rewarded with belonging. It's a hard thing to learn that those were never actually the same currency." I didn't cry in that session. I did the next one, once the sentence had had a week to settle into me properly. The quiet grief came later than I expected, in March, on an ordinary Tuesday when I was going through a box of old photos looking for a picture I needed for a work presentation about team history that had nothing to do with any of this. I found one from 2009, me at 16, Sawyer at 12, both of us gap-toothed and sunburned at a lake in Michigan our family used to drive to every August before money got tight enough that the trip stopped. He had his arm around my shoulders in that photo. He was smiling like I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. I sat on my bedroom floor and cried for the first time since all of it started. Not for the money, not for the house, but for that 12-year-old boy who used to run to the door when I came home from college on weekends. I didn't know exactly when he became someone who could stand in my kitchen and tell me I was nothing but a paycheck. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand it. Grief doesn't require an answer to be real. It just requires something true that you've lost. I've stopped trying to trace the exact moment the boy in that photograph turned into the man who stood in my kitchen and called me nothing but a paycheck. Maybe there wasn't one single moment. Maybe it was 100 small ones. 100 times someone let him take instead of teaching him to ask, until taking was simply the only language he had left for love. I put the photo back in the box. I didn't throw it away. I didn't know then if I ever would. Some Some evenings that spring, I'd catch myself standing in the kitchen doorway out of habit, half expecting to hear my mother's laugh drifting in from the next room, or the specific rattle of Sawyer's old truck pulling into the driveway. The habit faded slower than the people did. I think that's the part nobody warns you about, that the body keeps waiting for a family long after your mind has finally understood they aren't coming back the way they used to be. It takes longer to unlearn a house's old sounds than it does to change its locks. It's been almost a year and a half since the day my brother stood between me and my own refrigerator and told me he was going to erase me from the family. My house looks different now. I repainted the master bedroom a pale sage green that has nothing to do with any color my parents ever chose for it. I rebuilt my home office, new desk, new monitors, a locked filing cabinet this time, not because I don't trust anyone anymore, but because I finally understand that trust and access are two different things, and I'm allowed to protect both. I still work at Meridian Freight Systems. I got promoted to operations manager in the fall, a role that came with a $14,000 raise and, more importantly, came at a time when I finally had the bandwidth to actually want something for myself again, instead of just surviving whatever the week threw at me. Sawyer's restitution payments come in irregularly, $38 some weeks, nothing for months at a time when he's between jobs again, which is often. I don't check the account obsessively anymore. Vera set it up so it deposits automatically when it comes, and I let it exist as background noise in my life rather than the center of it. I don't know if I'll ever see the full $51,800 again. I've made peace with that in a way I didn't think I'd be capable of a year ago. The money was never really the point by the end. The point was making sure it was written down somewhere, permanently, that it happened, and that it wasn't my fault. My mother and I talk occasionally now, careful, guarded conversations, mostly about nothing, the weather, a recipe, a show she's watching. She's never fully apologized, not in the specific, itemized way I once thought I needed from her, but she came to my birthday in June, alone, without my father, and she brought the blue mixing bowls back, cleaned and wrapped in a dish towel, and told me she thought I should have them after all. It wasn't everything. It was something. My father and I don't talk much. He still believes, as far as I can tell, that I overreacted, that family doesn't keep score, that whatever happened in that house was somehow smaller than the way I responded to it. I've stopped trying to convince him otherwise. Some people will never see the version of events that doesn't put them at the center of their own innocence. I can't force that clarity on him. I can only decide how much of my life I let his refusal to see it cost me going forward. Sawyer and I haven't spoken since the courthouse hallway. I think about the boy in the lake photo sometimes, arm around my shoulders, gap-toothed and sunburned and 12 years old, and I let myself feel the loss of him honestly instead of pretending it isn't there. That version of my brother is gone, whether he was ever fully real to begin with, or whether Piper simply found the cracks that were already there and widened them until they swallowed him. I don't know which is true. I've stopped needing to know in order to move forward. Thanksgiving that first year alone was harder than I expected. I sat with the idea of an empty house for weeks before I finally called Denise and asked if she'd want to come over instead of hosting her usual gathering. She said yes before I'd even finished the question. We cooked together in my kitchen, the same kitchen my brother had once stood in, to tell me I was nothing but a paycheck. And by the end of the night, it smelled like her cooking instead of that memory, garlic and rosemary, and something warm baking in the oven I'd bought to replace the one Piper had scorched a burner on. Marcus came too and brought his girlfriend. And for the first time in over a year, my house was full of people who were there because they wanted to be, not because they needed somewhere to land. Aunt Denise and I have dinner together most Sundays now. Renata Cho and I still text occasionally, two women who never would have met if not for the worst thing either of us had lived through, bonded by it anyway. Judah sends me a card every Christmas with a single line inside, still keeping the receipts. I keep every one of them. People ask me sometimes, co-workers mostly, if I regret letting my family move in at all, if I wish I'd said no back in June of 2024 and saved myself a year of my life. I don't. Not entirely. I think there's a version of loving people where you offer them everything you have and find out, sometimes at enormous cost, exactly who they are when nothing is holding them accountable. I'd rather know than wonder. I think back sometimes to that Tuesday night in June of 2024, my father's voice tight on the phone, asking for 6 months. I don't regret saying yes. I regret how long it took me to notice that every boundary I set after that was treated as a suggestion rather than a rule, and how many times I apologized for asking my own family to respect a word as simple as no. I was 30 years old before I understood that being needed and being valued are not the same thing, and that a family can hollow you out completely while insisting the entire time that they love you. What I understand now, sitting in a house that finally, completely belongs to only me, is that family isn't a blank check you write in blood and never expect to be cashed responsibly. Love doesn't require me to disappear so someone else can be comfortable. It doesn't require me to be nothing but a paycheck, laughed at in my own kitchen, erased a little more with every month I stayed quiet. I took back every inch of my house, the bedroom, the office, the pool, the driveway, the kitchen where he said those words to me. I repainted some of it, rewired some of it, and left some of it exactly as it was, because not everything that happened there needs to be erased for me to keep living in it. Some nights, I still walk through the rooms just to feel the quiet. It isn't the triumphant kind of quiet you'd expect from a story with an ending this clean. It's smaller than that, and sadder, and more honest. It's the quiet of a house that is finally, entirely mine again, standing in the space where a family I loved used to be, grieving them and free of them in the very same breath.